Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping have issued a call for NATO to halt further expansion during a meeting on the sidelines of the opening of the Beijing Olympics on Friday. The meeting is President Xi's first face-to-face talks with a world leader in nearly 2 years. It comes as his country hosts the 2022 Winter Olympics. We have more in this report.
The two leaders' summit held on the day of the opening ceremony of the Beijing Winter Olympics marks a further step in what has become an increasingly close partnership between China and Russia. This comes as Russia and China's relations with the West deteriorate. According to an English-language version of the joint statement released by the Russian government, the two countries believe that certain states, military and political alliances and coalitions seek to obtain directly or indirectly unilateral military advantages to the detriment of the security of others. In the Kremlin statement, Russia and China also says they, quote, oppose further enlargement of NATO and call on the North Atlantic Alliance to abandon its ideologized Cold War approaches, to respect the sovereignty, security and interests of other countries, the diversity of their civilization, cultural and historical backgrounds, and to exercise a fair and objective attitude towards the peaceful development of other states. End of quote. Both leaders had an in-depth and thorough exchange of views on China-Russia relations and a series of major issues concerning international strategic security and stability, but made no direct mention of NATO.
For more on the controversial Russia-China relations, global affairs analyst Calvin Dark joins me virtually now from Washington to discuss this. Good to have you join us, Calvin Dark.
Good to be here.
So in this visit by China's president to Russia, as many as 15 deals will be signed. Some of them border on energy, issues around space or exploration as well. But, you know, one of the most interesting deals is the fact that Russia is looking to increase its gas exports to China to over 48 billion cubic meters. And this is coming at a time where Russia's supply of energy to Europe has come under scrutiny. What do you make of this, and how significant is this?
Well, I think it's very significant, particularly as we think about what's happening in the Ukraine, because as we all know, misdirecting the flow of this natural gas could have a really bad effect on the Russian economy, and of course it would affect European partners, and so that's obviously something that wants to be avoided. However, if Russia is able to supplement its revenues from natural gas by increasing the natural gas that it gives to China, that provides a cushion. And so that makes the stakes even higher, because what Russia is basically saying is it would be difficult if natural gas exports were changed or in any way stalled in Europe, but that they have another source of income that could help soften that blow.
And it almost seems like China is in a way of any attempt to isolate Russia in terms of sanctions, and China seems like the country that would stand as a buffer for Russia.
Yes, because China has decided that in this new age of, fighting against Western powers, particularly the United States, that because of the issues between China and the United States, they've hitched their horse, so to speak, to Russia. But it's complicated because we also have to remember, when it comes to Ukraine and China have very close ties, a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So yes, they are siding with Russia. They are trying to provide support to Russia against the Western powers, but they also have to look out their interests, and they don't want to mess up what they have going for them, as in what's happening, or as in their relationship with Ukraine.
And you're right about China's good relations with Ukraine, and that's why for people, a lot of people are wondering, this very open display of support from China to Russia's security concerns, what exactly is in it for China? What does China stand to benefit?
Well, I think what China stands to benefit is just in, I would call it soft power, and that, of course, they're hosting the Olympics. they get to show themselves as a real player in the world and not have to do what they believe the U.S. is telling them to do. So I believe it increases their influence. And they also, just like Russia with supplementing the revenue it gets from natural gas, China is also looking for other ways that it can have so that if things escalate with the United States, its own economy won't be damaged as much as it could have been. So China is playing a very tough game and very complicated game. I will say an interesting thing that I didn't realize until I saw on the news yesterday, that Putin has a habit or has a past of invading different areas after Olympics. He did in 2014 and after 2008. So maybe this is part of a strategic plan on his part, and I think that would actually be very interesting from China's part, considering he is there with Xi in China for the Olympics.
And, you know, it is also very interesting, this relations and alliance between China and Russia. You know, you rightly noted earlier about how Ukraine is also has good relations also with China, especially because they're also part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So one wonders if there are really plans by Russia to invade Ukraine and this tension in Europe because of Russia, how long can or will these countries continue to align?
Well, I think that Russia will continue to play this game as long as he sees that it puts everyone on guard and that it puts the U.S. in a very difficult position, because he obviously knows that the U.S. doesn't want to enter into any conflicts or necessarily lead one with NATO forces. Putin is very well aware that this is 2022 and we have midterm elections here with a president that is sinking in popularity. And that weakens Biden domestically on what he would choose to do internationally. So it still remains to be seen if Putin's threats to invade are serious. But what I think can be assured is that his shaking things up to keep everyone on edge and to keep everyone preoccupied with what's happening in Ukraine, that is a successful strategy.
Wouldn't that itself, for example, because my question really earlier was, wouldn't that be a threat to the China-Russia relations, especially because of where China also stands with Ukraine?
Well, I think in that sense, what we also have to think about is one of the things that came out of this meeting between the two leaders was a reaffirmation on the status of Taiwan, which, as you know, is a really, really big issue.
We have we're now joined by Calvin Dack to continue our conversation on the China-Russia relations. You were speaking earlier as to whether this will pose a threat to, if China decides to invade Russia, or rather Russia decides to invade Ukraine, looking at the standing between China and Ukraine as well, if this will pose a threat to the relations between China and Russia.
Yes, and what I was saying was that even though China is going to have to be very careful in what it does with regards to Ukraine, because they obviously don't want to mess up existing relationships, but the Taiwan issue could have influence on this, meaning that that was one of the first things that Russia, reaffirmed its support for China's position over Taiwan. And I don't think that was a mistake. I think it was very strategic, because China could support Russia in the situation with Ukraine if it is styled as, as Russia says, they claim that there's a big pro-Russian sentiment in the Ukraine for more Russian control. And if they can frame it in that issue, then China could be supportive just the way that Russia has supported it over the issue of Taiwan.
Beyond just trying to limit the influence of the West in their region, this is also a relationship of the sphere of influence. For example, I know that Russia supports China when it comes to issues of China over Taiwan. This is really about the sphere of influence, isn't it? We're supporting each other to take over each other's region.
Right, and supporting each other in a way that if they don't have the U.S. support, or if they are in direct conflict with the U.S. and other Western powers, that they can make it, that they don't have all of their eggs in one basket, so to speak. And I also believe that they being China and Russia, want to set a new framework around the world. The U.S. and Western powers have often emphasized, importance of human rights, climate change, and global warming. And these are things that Russia and China would like to handle differently, as they have different priorities. And I think that they are trying to set that new framework. we'll have to see how successful that's going to be, but they're at least trying.
And if you remember clearly, when the ECOWAS filed the sanctions against Mali's stance, but there were attempts to seek the support of the United Nations to back the sanctions, and then Russia and China blocked it. It also seems like the same thing could happen if there were attempts to get United Nations to support sanctions against Russia, that China is going to block it. So how can what can the U.S. and the Western allies do in terms of going around China to get Russia to continue to stick to diplomacy and not invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I think that's why the U.S. and NATO are going to be working together well, because it may actually be done under the auspices of NATO. Now, that doesn't mean that through the work of the UN Security Council that there can't be things that are either promoted or stopped by Russia and China on the council that could, put a few kinks in the plan. But I think this is why the U.S. is really emphasizing this is a NATO issue and protection of NATO members, so that Russia and China don't have that influence they have in the Security Council. And I think it's also important to note on that point, China has started to speak out in its support for Russia's position in not expanding NATO, which the only reason they would have to say that is to support Russia. So it goes to show you what Russia has made clear that it wants from China, and I'm sure vice versa, what China wants from Russia.
Talking about Ukraine and Russia, Russia is saying we do not want Ukraine to be part of NATO, but we're going to put 100,000 troops at the border just in case. And then we're seeing the support coming from the Western allies towards Ukraine to ensure that just in case anything happens, Ukraine is not without support. Do you think that the effort by Russia is being counterproductive in that it is now showing more reason why Ukraine should be part of NATO?
No, I don't. I mean, from Russia's point of view, I don't think so, because I think if he does decide to turn this from rhetoric to actual action and invading, he'll do it regardless. But, one of the things that I've found interesting, especially over the last 2 weeks here in the United States, is you have a lot of people that, want a strong stance against Russia, who are saying, you know what, if we can bring down the tension and, not risk American soldiers by just making a commitment to not ever allow, or at least in the near future, allow the Ukraine in NATO, then hey, let's do it. So that may be what the U.S. does, because while Russia keeps saying they don't want expansion of NATO, the Ukraine coming into NATO is not like it's on the agenda anytime in the near future. So if that's what Putin needs to lower the tension, there's growing support in the United States for that.
And we'll continue to follow developments in Russia, where the Chinese president is now visiting ahead of the Olympics, Winter Olympics. Thank you so much for talking to us, as always. Global Affairs Analyst Calvin Dark.
Thank you.